When most people think about heroes, they picture someone in a uniform or a cape. But sometimes the most extraordinary acts of courage happen in the most ordinary places. On a bitter February night in the Rocky Mountains, while a blizzard buried the world in snow and ice, a single mother working the graveyard shift at a remote airstrip was about to prove that heroism isn't about having superpowers. It's about having heart. Tess Morgan had been fixing planes since she was 16, her hands stained with grease, her back aching from long hours under aircraft bellies. She never expected to save anyone's life, let alone change her own forever. But when a billionaire's private jet made an emergency landing in the worst storm in decades, everything she thought she knew about her small world was about to shift. What happened next would challenge everything both of them believed about worth, class, and second chances. But will one act of kindness be enough to bridge the gap between two completely different worlds? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The wind howled across Copper Ridge Airfield like a living thing, angry and relentless, driving snow against the small hangar windows with the force of thrown sand. Inside, Tess Morgan pulled her wool cap down over her ears and adjusted the portable heater that barely made a dent in the February cold. The fluorescent lights overhead flickered occasionally, threatened by the storm that had been building for 3 days and showed no signs of letting up. At 34, Tess had the kind of quiet strength that came from years of making do with less. Her coveralls were patched at the knees and elbows, her work boots resoled twice, but her tools were immaculate, cleaned and organized with the precision of someone who understood that in her line of work, attention to detail could mean the difference between life and death. She moved around the small Cessna she was servicing with the fluid confidence of someone who had been working on aircraft since she was tall enough to reach the wing struts. The airfield sat at 8 to 200 feet elevation, nestled in a bowl between peaks that scraped the Colorado sky. During the summer tourist season, it buzzed with private jets carrying wealthy families to their mountain retreats, but winter transformed it into something more akin to an Arctic outpost. Most of the seasonal staff had been laid off in November. The office staff left at 5 sharp. By 8 p.m., when the storm really started showing its teeth, Tess was usually the only soul left on the property. Tonight was no different, except for the small bundle of blankets in the corner of the heated break room where her 12-year-old son, Danny, sat hunched over his math homework, pencil scratching against paper by the light of a battery-powered lantern. The boy had inherited his mother's dark hair and serious brown eyes, along with her stubborn determination to see things through to the end. "Mom, what's 7 times 43? Danny called out, his breath visible in the cold air despite the space heater humming nearby. "Work it out yourself, kiddo," Tess replied, without looking up from the engine she was examining. "Break it down into pieces you can handle. 7 times 40, then 7 times 3. She heard him mutter the numbers under his breath and smiled. Despite the ache in her lower back from bending over the aircraft for the past 6 hours, Danny was smart, smarter than she'd been at his age, certainly smarter than anyone in her family had ever expected to be. Sometimes she caught him reading books about engineering or watching documentaries about space exploration on the old tablet she'd managed to buy him for his birthday, and she felt a fierce pride mixed with a gnawing worry about what kind of future she could actually provide for him. The toolbox at her feet had belonged to her grandfather, a man who'd taught her that honest work with your hands was nothing to be ashamed of. The metal was dented and worn smooth in places from decades of use, first by Grandpa Joe, fixing tractors and farm equipment, then by Tess, working her way up from cleaning hangars to being one of the most trusted mechanics in 3 counties. The tools inside were a mix of old and new, some inherited, some carefully saved for over months of tight budgets. "Got it, Mom, 301. "Good job, sweetheart." Tess wiped her hands on a rag and glanced over at her son, who was already bent over the next problem. The sight of him there, so focused and determined, despite having to spend another evening in a cold hangar while she worked, made her chest tight with emotions she didn't have time to examine too closely. Tess had been working double shifts for 3 weeks now, ever since the airfield's other certified mechanic had quit to take a job in Denver. The pay wasn't great, never had been, but it was steady, and in a small mountain town where good jobs were scarce, steady meant everything. She'd been saving every extra penny, hoping to have enough put aside to maybe take Danny on a real vacation. Come summer, maybe even see the ocean, something neither of them had ever done. The Cessna's engine had been running rough, according to its owner, a local doctor who used it to reach patients in remote areas during medical emergencies. Tess had traced the problem to a clogged fuel injector, a relatively simple fix that would have cost twice as much at the larger facility down in Colorado Springs. Word of mouth was everything in her line of work, and her reputation for fair prices and reliable service had kept them fed and housed for the past 8 years, ever since Danny's father had decided that responsibility wasn't for him and disappeared one spring morning without so much as a goodbye note. She tried not to think about Marcus too often anymore. The anger had faded into something more like bewilderment. How do you just walk away from your own child? But Danny never asked about his father anymore, hadn't for years, and Tess had learned that some silences were kinder than words. The hangar smelled of motor oil, metal, and the particular staleness of a place that held machinery and human hopes in equal measure. Tess had come to find comfort in these scents, in the predictable rhythms of maintenance and repair. Engines made sense in a way that people often didn't. They had problems that could be diagnosed and fixed. They responded to care and attention with reliable performance. They didn't promise to love you forever and then vanish when things got complicated. Outside, the storm continued its assault on the mountains. The Weather Service had issued warnings about travel, predicting snowfall rates of up to 3 inches per hour and winds gusting to 70 miles per hour. Most sensible people were home by their fireplaces, not planning to fly anywhere until the system moved through. Tess had expected a quiet night, maybe finishing the Cessna and getting started on the oil change scheduled for tomorrow. She checked her watch. Nearly 10 p.m. Danny should probably try to get some sleep soon, though she knew he'd resist. The boy worried about her when she worked late, though he tried to hide it. He'd taken on too much responsibility for someone his age, she knew that. But what choice did they have? Childcare was expensive, and her mother lived 4 hours away in Grand Junction, dealing with her own health problems. "Mom, can I ask you something?" Danny's voice cut through her thoughts. "Course you can, kiddo. What's on your mind? Why do rich people need so many airplanes?" Tess glanced over at him, wondering what had prompted the question. "What do you mean?" "I was looking at the pictures on the office wall today, while you were working on Mr. Peterson's plane. All those jets that come through here in the summer. Some people have like 3 or 4 different ones. Seems like a lot." She considered her answer carefully. Danny was at an age where he was starting to notice the differences between their life and the lives of others, and she wanted to be honest without making him bitter. "I guess when you have a lot of money, you can afford things that seem excessive. To people like us, maybe they need different planes for different purposes, or maybe they just like having choices. Do you think they're happier than us?" The question caught her off guard. She set down her wrench and really looked at her son. Serious, thoughtful, growing up too fast in some ways and still beautifully innocent in others. "Honey, happiness isn't something you can buy. It comes from the people you love, the work that gives your life meaning, the feeling that you're making a difference somehow. Rich people can be miserable, and poor people can be joyful. It's more about what you do with what you have than how much you have to start with." Danny nodded solemnly, as if filing this information away for future consideration. "I think you're pretty happy, mostly." "I'm happy, Danny. I have you, I have work I'm good at. I have a roof over our heads and food on the table. That's more than a lot of people have." It was true, mostly. There were moments, usually late at night when the bills were spread across. The kitchen table and the numbers didn't quite add up the way she needed them to, when happiness felt like a luxury she couldn't afford. But those moments passed, and in the morning there was always Danny's smile over breakfast, or the satisfaction of solving a particularly tricky mechanical problem, or the simple pleasure of a job well done. The wind gusted particularly hard against the hangar, making the metal walls creak and groan. Tess had grown up in these mountains and had weathered plenty of storms, but this one felt different somehow, more intense, more personal, as if the weather itself was building towards something significant. She finished tightening the fuel injector and moved on to checking the oil levels, her movements automatic after years of practice. Tomorrow, she'd need to call Dr. Morrison and let him know his plane was ready, then start on the Piper that had been scheduled for its annual inspection. The work was steady, if not exciting, and it paid the bills. But sometimes, in quiet moments like this, Tess allowed herself to wonder what might have been different if she'd had other opportunities. She'd been good at math and science in high school, good enough that her physics teacher had encouraged her to think about engineering school. But college required money her family didn't have, and then Marcus had come along with his easy smile and grand promises. And before she knew it, she was 19 and pregnant and trying to figure out how to build a life for two people on the salary of someone who cleaned airplanes. She didn't regret Danny, not for a single second. He was the best thing that had ever happened to her, the reason she got up every morning and kept pushing forward when things got tough. But she sometimes wondered what doors might have opened if she'd had different choices, different chances. The storm outside seemed to be intensifying, if that was possible. Tess made a mental note to check the weather radar in the office before they left for the night. The road down the mountain could be treacherous in conditions like this, and she had no intention of taking unnecessary risks with Danny in the car. The emergency radio crackled to life at 11:47 p.m., cutting through the howling wind with a burst of static and a voice tight with controlled panic. Copper Ridge, this is November 787, Juliet Echo, requesting immediate emergency landing. We have a hydraulic failure and fuel system malfunction. Repeat, requesting emergency landing. Tess dropped her wrench and rushed to the radio mounted on the workbench, her heart rate spiking as adrenaline flooded her system. Emergency landings were rare at Copper Ridge. The airfield was small, tucked away in the mountains, and most aircraft in distress tried to make it to the larger facilities in Colorado Springs or Denver. November 787, Juliet Echo. This is Copper Ridge. You're cleared for emergency landing on runway 09. Be advised we have blizzard conditions with winds gusting to 70 knots and visibility near zero. Do you have souls on board? Copper Ridge. We have 2 souls. On board, pilot and passenger. We're approximately 15 minutes out, coming in from the northeast. Please have emergency services standing by. Tess's stomach dropped. The volunteer fire department was 20 minutes away in good weather, probably an hour in this storm if they could even get their trucks started. The nearest hospital was 45 minutes down a mountain road that would be impassable until the plows could get through, which wouldn't happen until morning at the earliest. November 787, Juliet. Echo, be advised that due to weather conditions, emergency services response may be delayed. We have 1 certified mechanic on site. Please describe the nature of your mechanical emergency. Danny had looked up from his homework, his young face suddenly alert and worried. Tess caught his eye and tried to project calm confidence, even as her mind raced through everything that could go wrong with a night landing in these conditions. Copper Ridge. We're experiencing complete hydraulic failure and intermittent fuel pump issues. We've been nursing her along for the past 40 minutes, but we're losing fuel pressure. We're going to need immediate mechanical assistance upon landing. The voice on the radio was professional and controlled, but Tess could hear the underlying tension. Whoever was flying that aircraft was dealing with multiple system failures in the worst possible conditions. The fact that they'd chosen to attempt a landing at Copper Ridge rather than trying to make it to a larger facility told her everything she needed to know about how desperate their situation was. Copy that. November 787, Juliet Echo. I'll have the runway lights activated and will be standing by with emergency equipment. What type of aircraft are you flying? Copper Ridge. We're in a Gulfstream G650. I repeat, Gulfstream G650. Tess felt her eyebrows rise. A G650 was a $75 million aircraft, the kind of jet that usually carried corporate executives, celebrities, or extremely wealthy private individuals. Definitely not the type of plane she was used to seeing at their small mountain airfield, especially not in emergency conditions. "Mom," Danny's voice was small, uncertain. "It's going to be okay, sweetheart. Just someone who needs help getting their plane fixed so they can get home safely." She kept her voice steady, reassuring, even as her mind catalogued everything she knew about Gulfstream hydraulic systems and fuel pump configurations. She'd worked on corporate jets before, during her brief stint at the maintenance facility in Denver 8 years ago, but never a G650. These were sophisticated machines with complex computer-controlled systems, far more advanced than the single-engine aircraft and small twins she typically serviced. But an engine was an engine, hydraulics were hydraulics, and fuel systems followed the same basic principles regardless of how much money had been spent on the airframe. November 787. Juliet Echo. Be advised, I'm activating runway. Lights now. Wind is 090 at 65, gusting to 70. Altimeter 2885. You're cleared to land any runway. Tess grabbed her heavy winter coat from the hook by the door and pulled on her insulated gloves, the ones she'd inherited from her grandfather, thick leather worn soft by decades of use, stained with oil and hydraulic fluid from 1,000 different repairs. They'd never failed her yet. "Danny, I need you to stay in here where it's warm, okay? This is going to take a while, and I don't want you getting cold or getting in the way while I'm trying to help these people." "Can I watch from the window?" She hesitated. Part of her wanted to shield him from what could potentially be a traumatic scene if the landing went badly. But another part of her knew that hiding in the break room wouldn't make him any safer if something catastrophic happened, and at 12 years old, he was mature enough to handle seeing her do her job. "You can watch, but you stay inside no matter what happens, understood? Even if it looks like I need help, you don't come outside. If something goes really wrong, you call 911, and then call Grandma Jean." Danny nodded solemnly, the seriousness of the situation clearly sinking in. Tess grabbed her emergency kit and headed for the door, pausing to flip the switches that would illuminate the runway. The sudden brightness outside was immediately swallowed by the swirling snow, but it would give the pilot something to aim for. The cold hit her like a physical blow as she stepped outside, the wind driving snow against her face with stinging force. Visibility was virtually zero. She could barely make out the runway lights, and she knew exactly where they were. How anyone was going to land an aircraft in these conditions was beyond her comprehension, but pilots were trained for situations like this. She had to trust that whoever was flying that Gulfstream knew what they were doing. She positioned herself near the hangar where she'd have a clear view of the runway approach, but would be out of the way if the landing went badly. The emergency kit contained basic first aid supplies, fire extinguisher, and emergency flares, but she found herself hoping desperately that she wouldn't need any of them. The sound of the approaching aircraft was barely audible over the wind. At first, just a low drone that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. Then it grew stronger, more focused, and she caught a glimpse of navigation lights through the snow, red and green strobes that disappeared and reappeared as the aircraft fought its way through the storm. The pilot was coming in steep and fast, probably dealing with reduced lift from the wind shear and trying to get the aircraft on the ground before the fuel pumps failed completely. Tess held her breath as the landing lights appeared through the snow, brilliant white beams that illuminated the swirling flakes for just a moment before the aircraft touched down hard on the runway. The Gulf Stream bounced once, settled, and rolled out much farther than normal before finally coming to a stop about 3/4 of the way down the runway. Even from her position by the hangar, Tess could see that the aircraft was still running. Engines spooled up, which meant the pilot was probably afraid to shut down in case they couldn't restart. She grabbed her toolbox and ran toward the aircraft, fighting against the wind with each step. As she got closer, she could see that this was indeed a serious machine, sleek, expensive, and clearly in distress. Hydraulic fluid was leaking from somewhere near the landing gear, leaving dark stains in the snow, and she could hear the irregular cycling of what sounded like fuel pumps struggling to maintain pressure. A door opened on the side of the aircraft, and a figure in an expensive-looking suit stepped out into the storm. Even in the darkness and swirling snow, she could tell this was someone accustomed to being in charge, someone whose presence commanded attention. He was tall, probably in his mid-40s, with the kind of confident bearing that came from years of making decisions that affected other people's lives. "Are you the mechanic?" he called out over the wind. "I'm Tess Morgan. I run maintenance here. What's your situation?" He moved closer, and she could see his face more clearly in the glow from the aircraft's exterior lights. Sharp features, intelligent eyes, and the kind of expensive haircut that probably cost more than she made in a week. But there was genuine concern in his expression, not arrogance. "Julian Cross, we've got multiple system failures. Hydraulics are completely shot, fuel pumps are intermittent, and we're not sure what else might be compromised. My pilot says we can't restart if we shut down, and we can't stay running indefinitely." The name Julian Cross meant nothing to Tess, but his aircraft and his manner suggested serious wealth. The kind of person who was probably used to having problems solved quickly and efficiently by throwing money at them. But money wouldn't fix mechanical failures in a blizzard at 11,000 feet above sea level. "Let me take a look," she said, pulling out her flashlight and moving toward the landing gear. "How long have you been dealing with these problems?" "About 90 minutes, Julian replied, following close behind as Tess approached the aircraft. "Started with just the hydraulics, but the fuel system problems began about 20 minutes ago." Tess knelt beside the main landing gear, her flashlight beam revealing a steady drip of hydraulic fluid that was already freezing in the sub-zero air. The leak was coming from a fitting near the top of the strut, probably loosened by the vibration and stress of flying with a compromised system. "We'll need to get this bird into the hangar before I can do any real work on it," she called over the wind. "But first, let me see what we're dealing with." She pulled out her worn copy of the aircraft maintenance manual she'd brought from the Denver facility years ago. The pages were dog-eared and stained, annotations written in her careful handwriting filling the margins. Julian watched with obvious surprise as she flipped through the technical diagrams by flashlight, cross-referencing. "Hydraulic system schematics with fuel pump locations. You're familiar with G650 systems?" he asked, and there was something in his voice that might have been doubt. Tess looked up at him, noting the expensive watch, the perfectly tailored coat, the way he stood like someone who expected deference. "Mr. Cross, I've been working on aircraft for 18 years. I may not have seen everything, but I understand how hydraulic systems work, and I understand how fuel pumps work. The principles are the same, whether we're talking about a Cessna or a Gulf Stream." She turned back to the manual, finding the section she needed. "Your main hydraulic reservoir is probably empty or nearly empty. The fuel pumps are likely cavitating because of air in the lines, which means we've got multiple leaks somewhere in the system. The question is whether the damage is catastrophic or just messy." Julian's pilot appeared at the aircraft door, a competent-looking woman in her 50s with the calm demeanor of someone who'd spent decades dealing with mechanical emergencies. "How are we looking?" the pilot called out. "Still assessing," Tess replied. "How much fuel do you have left?" Maybe 40 minutes at idle. Less if we try to taxi. Tess nodded and moved around to examine the other side of the aircraft. The wind was making it difficult to see clearly, but she could make out additional hydraulic stains near the nose gear. This wasn't just a single-point failure. They were dealing with a cascade of problems that had probably started small and grown worse under stress. "We need to get this aircraft moved before we lose power completely," she said, making her decision. "I can't fix anything out here in this weather, and if those engines quit, we won't be able to restart them." "The hangar's big enough?" Julian asked, looking skeptically at the modest building. "It'll be tight, but we can make it work." Tess was already calculating clearances in her head. The G650 was larger than anything she'd ever put in their hangar, but the doors were wide enough and the ceiling was high enough. Barely. She jogged back toward the hangar, fighting the wind with each step. Danny was pressed against the window, watching everything with wide eyes. She gave him a thumbs up and mouthed, "It's okay," before hitting the controls to open the large hangar doors. The sound of the doors opening was nearly lost in the howling wind, but gradually the hangar's interior lights spilled out onto the tarmac, creating a beacon in the storm. Tess ran back to the aircraft, where Julian and his pilot were having an intense conversation. "Your call, Cap," Julian was saying as Tess approached, "but I trust Ms. Morgan's assessment." The pilot looked at Tess with professional interest. "Captain Sarah Chen, you think you can get us flying again?" "I won't know for sure until I can really examine the systems, but hydraulic leaks are usually fixable if we can find replacement parts or fabricate temporary solutions. The fuel system problems might be related to the hydraulics. If you've got fluid contamination in the fuel lines, that could explain the pump issues." Captain Chen nodded slowly. "All right, let's get her inside before we're walking home." The next 20 minutes were some of the most nerve-wracking of Tess's career, moving a $75 million aircraft into a hangar designed for much. Smaller planes required precision she couldn't afford to get wrong. Captain Chen proved to be an excellent pilot, following Tess's hand signals with millimeter accuracy as they gradually worked the Gulf Stream through the hangar doors. With barely 3 feet of clearance on either side and less than 2 feet above, the vertical stabilizer, the aircraft fit into the hangar like an expensive suit that had been tailored to the exact measurements of its wearer. As soon as the tail cleared the doors, Tess hit the switch to close them, shutting out the storm and its numbing cold. The sudden quiet was almost shocking after hours of wind noise. In the relative warmth of the hangar, with proper lighting and access to her tools, Tess felt her confidence returning. This was her domain, her territory, and she knew how to solve mechanical problems. "Danny, come meet our guests," she called out. Her son emerged from the break room looking simultaneously curious and shy. "Mr. Cross, Captain Chen, this is my son Danny. Danny, these folks had some trouble with their airplane and need our help." "Getting it fixed." Julian extended his hand to Danny with the same seriousness he might have shown to an adult business partner. "Pleasure to meet you, Danny. I hope we haven't interrupted your evening too much." "It's okay," Danny replied, shaking the offered hand. "Mom fixes planes all the time. She's really good at it." Tess felt a warm flush of pride at her son's simple confidence in her abilities. Julian seemed to notice it too, his expression softening slightly as he looked between mother and son. "I can see that," Julian said. "Your mom seems to know exactly what she's doing." Tess was already pulling out her larger tools, setting up work lights around the aircraft's problem areas. "Captain Chen, can you walk me through exactly what happened? Start from when you first noticed the hydraulic problems." As the pilot described the sequence of failures, Tess found herself building a mental picture of the cascade of problems. It sounded like a classic case of maintenance-deferred issues finally catching up with an aircraft under stress. Small leaks that had been monitored rather than fixed, seals that had been stretched beyond their service life, and systems that had been operating at the margins of their design parameters. "When was your last major hydraulic service?" she asked. Captain Chen and Julian exchanged a look. "About 8 months ago," the pilot admitted. "We've been meaning to schedule a comprehensive inspection, but..." But business travel doesn't wait. For maintenance schedules, Tess finished. She'd heard this story before, though usually from owners of much less expensive aircraft. Let me guess, you've been monitoring the hydraulic fluid levels and topping them off as needed. Something like that, Julian said, looking slightly embarrassed. Tess nodded without judgment. It happens to the best of us. The good news is that this looks like a maintenance issue rather than a fundamental system failure. The bad news is that we're going to need parts, and getting them delivered to a mountain airfield in a blizzard isn't going to be easy. She was already mentally cataloguing what she had in stock that might work as temporary solutions. Her grandfather's toolbox contained adapters and fittings that might not be original equipment, but could serve as emergency repairs. The key would be finding solutions that were safe enough to get the aircraft to a proper maintenance facility. How long do you think it might take? Julian asked. Tess looked at the complex aircraft filling her small hangar, then at her son, who was trying to stay out of the way, while obviously fascinated by the expensive machine. Give me a few hours to really assess what we're dealing with. Then I'll have a better idea of what's possible and what's not. As Tess began her systematic examination of the aircraft, Danny had moved closer to watch her work. His math homework lay forgotten on the break room table, replaced by wide-eyed fascination as his mother diagnosed problems on a machine worth more than their house, their car, and probably everything they owned combined. "What's that?" Danny asked, pointing to a complex assembly of valves and actuators that Tess was examining with her flashlight. "That's the main hydraulic distribution manifold," Tess explained patiently. "It's like the heart of the hydraulic system. It takes pressure from the pumps and sends it to all the different components that need it. Landing gear, flight controls, brakes, that sort of thing." Julian found himself listening to this explanation with genuine interest. He'd flown in corporate jets for 15 years, but had never really understood how they worked beyond the basic concept of wings generating lift. Watching Tess explain complex mechanical systems to her son with the same patience she might use to help with homework, he began to realize that his initial assumption about her capabilities had been not just wrong, but embarrassingly wrong. "And when it breaks," Danny continued, "when it breaks, the pilot has to work a lot harder to control the airplane," Tess said, glancing at Captain Chen with a slight smile. "But pilots are trained for that. Captain Chen did an excellent job getting you here safely in very difficult conditions." The pilot nodded appreciatively. "Your mother knows what she's talking about, Danny. This is definitely not a job for beginners." Tess had been working steadily for over an hour, and Julian was struck by her methodical approach. She didn't rush, didn't make assumptions, and took careful notes on everything she found. When she discovered a particularly problematic seal that was clearly the source of most of the hydraulic fluid loss, she spent 20 minutes examining it from every angle before making any pronouncements about repairability. "The main leak is definitely here," she finally announced, pointing to a fitting that connected two major hydraulic lines. "The seal has completely failed, probably due to age and thermal cycling. The good news is that this is a standard component that I can probably rebuild with parts I have in stock." "You keep hydraulic seals for Gulfstream jets in stock?" Julian asked, not bothering to hide his skepticism. Tess looked at him with the patient expression of someone explaining something obvious to a child. "Mr. Cross, hydraulic seals are standardized components. The seal that fits your $75 million jet is the same seal that fits a hydraulic jack or a tractor hydraulic cylinder. Different applications, same basic technology." She disappeared into her parts storage area and returned with a small box containing various rubber seals and O-rings. "The trick is finding the right size and pressure rating. Too small and it won't seal. Too big and it won't fit. Wrong pressure rating and it fails under load." Danny had positioned himself where he could watch his mother work without getting in her way. Julian noticed how the boy anticipated what tools she might need, quietly handing her wrenches or flashlights without being asked. This was clearly not the first time he'd spent an evening watching his mother solve complex mechanical problems. "How long have you been doing this?" Julian asked Tess, as she carefully measured the failed seal with calipers. "Fixing planes?" "About 18 years. Started when I was 16, working weekends and summers cleaning hangars and learning from the mechanics. Turned out I had a knack for understanding how things work. And you've been working here at Copper Ridge for 8 years, since Danny was 4. Her tone carried a note of finality that suggested this line of questioning was moving into territory she preferred not to discuss. Julian found himself curious about what had brought a clearly talented mechanic to a small mountain airfield, but he recognized the signal to back off. Instead, he watched as she selected a seal from her collection and began the delicate process of disassembling the hydraulic fitting. The work required removing panels and components to access the problem area, and Julian was impressed by how efficiently she worked despite the cramped conditions. She had obviously done this type of repair before, though probably not on aircraft quite this expensive. "Can I help?" Danny asked, as his mother struggled to reach a particularly awkward bolt. "You can hold this flashlight steady for me," Tess replied, positioning him where the light would be most useful. "And keep an eye on that hydraulic fluid reservoir. Let me know if the level changes while I'm working." Julian watched this interaction with growing respect for both mother and son. There was an easy partnership between them, born of years of shared experience and mutual dependence. Danny wasn't just being helpful. He clearly understood what his mother was doing and why it mattered. "Mr. Cross," Danny said suddenly, "what do you do when you're not flying around in airplanes?" Julian was surprised by the directness of the question. "I run a company that invests in other companies. We look for businesses that have good ideas but need money to grow, and we help them succeed." "Like a bank?" "Sort of, but not exactly. Banks loan money and expect it to be paid back. We buy part of the company and become partners with the people who started it." Danny considered this for a moment. "Do you help them fix things when they break?" The question was innocent, but it hit Julian. In an unexpected way, most of his business relationships were about maximizing returns, optimizing efficiency, and scaling operations. When portfolio companies had problems, his usual approach was to bring in consultants, replace management, or simply cut losses and move on. The idea of actually getting his hands dirty to fix problems was foreign to his usual experience. "Not usually," he admitted. "I generally hire other people to fix things. Like Mom. Like your mom, yes." Tess had successfully removed the failed seal and was examining it under a magnifying glass. "This definitely needs to be replaced. The rubber has hardened and cracked, probably from heat cycling, but I think I have something that will work." She selected another seal from her collection and began the careful process of installation. Julian found himself fascinated by the precision required. Every component had to be absolutely clean, every torque specification had to be exactly right, and every connection had to be tested multiple times before being considered reliable. "This is actually pretty interesting," he said to Captain Chen, who was monitoring the repair process with professional interest. "Aircraft maintenance is half science, half art," the pilot replied. "You need to understand the theory, but you also need the experience to know what's normal and what's not. Your Ms. Morgan clearly has both." As if to prove the point, Tess paused in her work and tilted her head slightly, listening to something the others couldn't hear. "Captain Chen, can you cycle the hydraulic pumps for me? I want to hear how they sound with the new seal installed." The pilot moved to the cockpit and activated the hydraulic system. Through the aircraft's structure, Julian could hear the subtle change in pump noise as pressure built in the system. "Better?" Tess announced after listening for several minutes. "Much better. I think we've solved the main leak." Danny beamed with pride at his mother's success. Julian found himself smiling too, caught up in the satisfaction of watching a competent professional solve a complex problem with skill and determination. By 4 in the morning, Tess had the hydraulic system functional and was working on the fuel pump irregularities. The storm outside had finally begun to subside, though snow continued to fall steadily. Danny had dozed off in the break room, wrapped in Tess's spare jacket, his homework finally completed and tucked neatly into his backpack. Julian had insisted on staying awake through the entire repair process, bringing Tess coffee from the break room and asking intelligent questions about what she was doing. Captain Chen had managed a few hours of sleep in the aircraft's passenger cabin, but emerged periodically to check on progress and offer technical insights from the pilot's perspective. "I think that's got it," Tess announced as she completed the final fuel system test. "Pressure's holding steady, no more leaks that I can find, and all the warning lights are off." She wiped her hands on a rag and looked at the expensive aircraft with satisfaction. It wasn't pretty. There were temporary patches visible where she'd made repairs, and some of the access panels would need to be properly reinstalled by a certified facility, but it was airworthy. "Captain Chen, want to run through your pre-flight checks?" The pilot emerged from the cabin looking refreshed and alert. "Absolutely. Let's see what we've got." The next 30 minutes involved a systematic verification of every system Tess had worked on. Hydraulic pressure held steady. Fuel pumps maintained consistent flow. Flight control surfaces moved smoothly through their full range of motion. Everything that had been broken was now working reliably. "Outstanding work," Captain Chen announced. "This aircraft is ready to fly." Julian stood quietly for a moment, watching Tess pack her tools with the same methodical precision she'd used throughout the repair process. Her coveralls were stained with hydraulic fluid and grease. Her hair was coming loose from the ponytail she'd started with 8 hours ago, and she looked exhausted. But there was also an unmistakable satisfaction in her expression, the look of someone who had tackled a difficult challenge and succeeded. "What do I owe you?" he asked. Tess paused in her tool organization and looked at him with surprise. "Oh, we. Me? For the repair work. Parts, labor, the emergency call-out. What's the bill?" She was quiet for a long moment, considering. Julian got the impression she was doing calculations in her head, weighing factors he probably couldn't imagine. "No charge," she said finally. "I'm sorry." "No charge. You were in trouble. I helped you get out of trouble. That's what people do." Julian stared at her in disbelief. "Ms. Morgan, you just worked for 8 hours to repair a $75 million aircraft. You used your parts, your expertise, your time. This isn't charity work." Tess met his gaze steadily. Around her throat, barely visible above the collar of her coveralls, was a thin chain that held what looked like a simple gold band, a wedding ring worn close to her heart rather than on her finger. Julian found himself wondering about the story behind that choice. "Mr. Cross, you seem like a decent person who found himself in a bad situation through no fault of his own. You were polite to my son. You didn't act like I was incompetent because I'm a woman or because I work at a small airfield, and you didn't try to throw money around to make problems disappear. As far as I'm concerned, helping you was just the right thing to do. But my kid's gotta eat, and I've got bills to pay, same as everyone else, but I don't take money for doing what's right. Call it old-fashioned if you want." Captain Chen was watching this exchange with obvious interest. Julian got the feeling that she was seeing something in this interaction that he was missing, some subtext that escaped him. "At least let me cover your parts costs," Julian insisted. "Those seals and fittings had to come from somewhere. Parts cost maybe $40. I think I can manage $40, Mr. Cross." There was something in her tone that warned him not to push further. This wasn't about the money, he realized. This was about dignity, about self-reliance, about maintaining control over her own choices. Pressing the issue would be insulting rather than generous. "All right," he said quietly, "but if you ever need anything, anything at all, I want you to call me." He pulled out his wallet and extracted a business card, then took a pen and wrote additional numbers on the back. That's my direct line, and that's my personal cell phone. 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. I mean it. Tess took the card and glanced at it briefly before tucking it into her pocket. Julian Cross, Crosswinds Venture Capital, with an address in Denver and phone numbers that suggested serious money and serious connections. I appreciate that, Mr. Cross. I really do. But I've been taking care of myself and Danny for a long time now. We're doing just fine. There was pride in her voice, but also something that might have been loneliness. Julian found himself wondering what it would be like to carry that kind of responsibility alone, to be the only person standing between your child and an uncertain world. Danny stirred in the break room and sat up, rubbing his eyes and looking around with the confusion of someone waking up in an unexpected place. "Is everything okay, Mom?" "Everything's fine, sweetheart. Mr. Cross and Captain Chen are ready to head home now." Danny stood and walked over to where the adults were standing. "Did you fix their airplane?" "We fixed it together," Tess said, ruffling his hair affectionately. "You were a big help holding those flashlights steady." Julian watched this interaction with growing respect for the relationship between mother and son. There was an easy affection between them, but also a sense of partnership that spoke to years of facing challenges together. "Danny," Julian said, "your mother is one of the most skilled mechanics I've ever encountered. You should be very proud of her." The boy straightened with obvious pride. "I am. Mom can fix anything. I believe it." Captain Chen had completed her final pre-flight inspection and was preparing to start the engines. "Mr. Cross, we should probably get moving. Weather window looks good for the next few hours, but that could change." Julian nodded, but found himself reluctant to leave. The past 8 hours had been unlike anything in his usual experience. Not just the mechanical emergency, but the glimpse into a way of life he'd never really considered before. Watching Tess work, seeing her relationship with Danny, experiencing the simple generosity of someone who helped others without expecting anything in return, had challenged assumptions he hadn't even realized he was making. "Ms. Morgan, Tess, thank you for everything. Safe travels, Mr. Cross. And next time, don't wait 8 months between hydraulic services." He laughed despite himself. "I'll make a note of that." As the Gulfstream's engines spooled up and Captain Chen began the process of taxiing out of the hangar, Julian looked back through the small window at Tess and Danny standing in the doorway, watching them leave. The image stayed with him as they took off into the grey dawn sky, climbing above the snow-covered peaks toward the business meetings and corporate decisions that suddenly seemed much less important than they had 12 hours ago. 3 days later, Tess was under the hood of Dr. Morrison's Cessna when she heard the sound of a vehicle pulling into the airfield parking area. The engine noise was different from the usual cars and pickup trucks that visited Copper Ridge. Deeper, more substantial. She wiped her hands on a rag and walked to the hangar door to investigate. A black pickup truck sat in the parking area, and Julian Cross was climbing out of the driver's seat. He was dressed differently than he had been during the emergency. Jeans, work boots, and a heavy winter jacket that looked like it had actually been used for outdoor work rather than just fashion. The truck's bed was covered with a tarp, concealing whatever cargo he'd brought with him. Danny was at his usual spot in the break room, working on a science project that involved building a model airplane from balsa wood and tissue paper. He looked up as Julian approached the hangar entrance. "Mr. Cross," Danny called out, genuinely pleased to see him again. "Hello, Danny. How's that homework coming along?" "It's a science project now. I'm building a model of a P-51 Mustang. Want to see?" Julian's face lit up with what appeared to be genuine interest. "I'd love to see it." Tess watched this interaction with mixed feelings. She was touched that Julian had remembered Danny and seemed to genuinely care about the boy's interests. But she was also wary of what his return might mean. In her experience, wealthy people didn't make social calls to mountain airfields without wanting something. "What brings you back to Copper Ridge, Mr. Cross?" she asked, keeping her tone neutral. "Julian, please, and I brought you something." He gestured toward the truck. "Actually, several somethings." Mr. Cross. Julian, I told you I don't need anything. Danny and I are doing fine. I know you are, but I also know it's been cold this week, and I happen to have some extra supplies that I thought you might be able to use. He walked to the truck and began pulling back the tarp, revealing cases of bottled water, several boxes of non-perishable food, winter coats that looked like they were Danny's size, and what appeared to be school supplies, notebooks, pencils, calculator, and other items that any student would need. The forecast calls for another storm this weekend, Julian continued, and I thought it might be nice to have some backup supplies on hand, just in case. Tess felt her jaw tighten. This looks like charity, Julian. It's not charity. It's gratitude from someone who would have been stranded in a storm if not for your help. There's a difference. Danny had come over to examine the supplies, his eyes wide with interest at the winter coat that was clearly intended for him. Mom, look, it's got a hood and everything. The coat was high quality, the kind of technical outdoor gear that cost several $100s and was designed for serious winter conditions. Not the sort of thing she could afford on her mechanic's salary, especially not with Danny growing as fast as he was. Julian, this is too much. It's not enough, he replied quietly. Not compared to what you did for us, but it's what I can do. Without making you feel like I'm trying to solve problems with money, there was something in his tone that made her look at him more carefully. This didn't feel like the casual generosity of someone who had more money than he knew what to do with. There was thought behind it, consideration for her pride and her circumstances. Besides, he continued, I was hoping you might be willing to show me around the airfield. I've been flying for years, but I've never really understood what happens. On the maintenance side, I'm curious about how everything works. Danny immediately perked up. Mum's really good at explaining airplane stuff. She taught me about lift and thrust and drag and all that. Tess found herself smiling despite her reservations. Did she now? She did. And she showed me how to check oil levels and look for problems. With the engines, I might want to be a pilot someday, or maybe an engineer. Julian looked at Danny with serious attention. Those are both excellent careers. Have you thought about what kind of engineering you might want to study? Aerospace engineering, probably, or maybe mechanical engineering, like what Mom does? Both good choices. There are some excellent engineering programs in Colorado. Tess felt a familiar pang at the mention of college programs. Danny was smart enough for engineering school, she had no doubt about that. But college was expensive, even the state schools, and she wasn't sure how she was going to make that work on a mechanic's salary. She'd been putting a little money aside when she could, but at the current rate, she'd have maybe enough for 1 year's tuition by the time Danny graduated high school. Julian, she said, making a decision, if you're really interested in learning about aircraft maintenance, I suppose I could show you around. But I want to be clear that you don't owe us anything. You paid for your rescue by being decent people during a difficult situation. Fair enough, but I'm still curious about what you do here. Over the next hour, Tess found herself giving Julian a comprehensive tour of the airfield facilities. She showed him the different types of aircraft they serviced, explained the various maintenance procedures required for airworthiness, and demonstrated some of the diagnostic techniques she used to identify problems. Julian proved to be an attentive student, asking intelligent questions and showing genuine interest in the technical details. He seemed particularly fascinated by the regulatory aspects of aircraft maintenance. The paperwork, the certification requirements, the chain of accountability that ensured every repair was documented and traceable. It's more complicated than I expected, he admitted, as they examined the engine compartment of a Piper Cherokee. I always assumed you just fixed what was broken and sent the plane back out. That's part of it, Tess agreed. But the documentation is just as important as the actual repair work. Every component has a service life. Every procedure has to be done according to manufacturer specifications. And every mechanic has to be properly certified for the work they're doing. Cut corners on any of that, and people die. Danny had been following the tour with obvious pride in his mother's expertise. "Mom knows all the rules," he said. "She's got certificates and everything." "I'm sure she does," Julian replied, and there was respect in his voice that hadn't been there during their first meeting. As they walked back toward the hangar, Julian's business card fell out of Tess's pocket where she'd kept it since the night of the repair. She bent to pick it up, and Julian noticed her handling it carefully, as if it was something valuable. "You kept it," he observed. "Seemed like the polite thing to do," she replied, but there was something in her expression that suggested the card meant more to her than simple politeness would require. Julian found himself wondering what it would be like to live in a world where business cards from successful people were rare enough to be treasured, where an unexpected kindness from a stranger was significant enough to be remembered for days afterward. "Tess," he said, as they reached the hangar, "would you and Danny like to have dinner sometime? Somewhere nice, as a proper thank you for what you did." She was quiet for a moment, considering. "That's very kind, Julian, but I don't think Danny and I would fit in at the kind of places you probably eat. Then we'll find somewhere that all of us will be comfortable," he replied. "What kind of food does Danny like?" 2 weeks later, Julian had become a regular visitor to Copper Ridge Airfield. What had started as a simple thank you gesture had evolved into something more meaningful, a genuine friendship that surprised all three of them. He would arrive on Saturday afternoons, sometimes with supplies, sometimes with books for Danny, always with genuine interest in their daily lives. On this particular afternoon, Danny was working on his science project while Tess performed routine maintenance on a Beechcraft Bonanza. Julian had volunteered to help, and though his contributions were more enthusiastic than skilled, Tess found his presence surprisingly comfortable. "Julian," Danny said suddenly, looking up from his model airplane, "what did you want to be when you were my age?" The question seemed to catch Julian off guard. He set down the wrench he'd been awkwardly attempting to use and was quiet for a long moment. "That's a complicated question, Danny. How come?" Julian glanced at Tess, who was watching the conversation with interest while continuing her work on the aircraft's engine. "When I was your age, I wanted to be a lot of things. A pilot, an astronaut, an inventor. I read every book I could find about flying and space travel and how machines worked." He paused, seeming to weigh his words carefully. "But I didn't think any of those things were realistic possibilities for someone like me." "Someone like you?" Danny asked, confused. "But you're rich and successful, and you fly around in your own airplane." "I wasn't always rich, Danny. That came much later." Tess looked up from her work, suddenly paying closer attention to the conversation. Julian sat down on a nearby crate, bringing himself to Danny's eye level. "When I was 12 years old, I was living in a foster home in Detroit. My parents had died in a car accident when I was 9, and I'd been bounced around between different families for 3 years. The people I was staying with weren't bad people, but they weren't particularly interested in my dreams about becoming an astronaut." Danny's eyes widened. "You were an orphan?" "I was. And the foster care system in the 1980s wasn't exactly designed to nurture ambitious career goals in kids from broken homes. Most people assumed I'd be lucky to graduate high school and find a job in a factory somewhere." Tess had stopped working entirely now, her full attention focused on Julian's story. This was not what she had expected to hear from someone who owned a $75 million aircraft. "So what happened?" Danny asked. "I got lucky. When I was 14, I was placed with a family that was different from the others. Ed and Margaret Santos. Ed was a mechanic. Actually, he reminded me a lot of your mother. He worked on cars instead of airplanes. But he had the same kind of practical intelligence, the same ability to diagnose problems and find solutions." Julian's voice carried a warmth that suggested deep affection for these people from his past. "Ed noticed that I was good with numbers and mechanical things. He started teaching me about engines and electrical systems and how to use tools properly. But more importantly, he started talking to me about college, about possibilities I'd never considered." "Did you become a mechanic too?" Danny asked. "For a while, yes. I worked in Ed's garage all through high school, learning everything he could teach me. But Ed kept pushing me to think bigger. He helped me apply for scholarships, helped me with the paperwork, even helped me buy my first decent set of clothes. And for college interviews, Tess felt something shift in her understanding of Julian Cross. The confident businessman she'd met during the emergency landing suddenly seemed like a different person, or perhaps the same person viewed from a completely different angle. I studied engineering at Wayne State University on a full scholarship, Julian continued. Mechanical engineering, actually, just like what you're thinking about, Danny. Ed and Margaret came to my graduation, and Ed cried when I walked across the stage to get my diploma. Said it was the proudest day of his life. Is that when you became rich? Danny asked with the direct curiosity of a 12-year-old. Julian laughed. Not exactly. After college, I worked as an engineer for a few years, but I discovered I was more interested in the business side of technology than the technical side. I went back to school for an MBA, then started working in venture capital. That's where the money came from, helping other people build successful companies. He pulled out his wallet and showed Danny a worn photograph. An older man with grease-stained hands, standing next to a younger Julian in a graduation cap and gown. This is Ed Santos. He died 5 years ago. But everything I've accomplished started with him believing in a kid who had nothing and no prospects. He didn't just teach me about engines. He taught me that where you come from doesn't determine where you can go. Tess felt her throat tighten with unexpected emotion. She looked at the photograph, seeing in the older man's proud expression something she recognized from her own relationship with Danny, the fierce protectiveness and hope that parents feel for their children's futures. Julian, she said quietly, why are you telling us this? He looked at her directly, and she could see that he was choosing his words carefully. Because 3 weeks ago, when my plane broke down here, I met a 12-year-old boy who reminds me a lot of myself at that age. Smart, curious, full of potential. And I met his mother, who reminds me a lot of Ed Santos. Someone with practical intelligence and real skill. Someone who cares more about doing the right thing than about personal gain. He reached into his jacket and pulled out a manila envelope. And because I've spent the last 3 weeks thinking about how to offer help without insulting anyone's pride or independence. Tess stared at the envelope with growing suspicion. Julian, what is that? It's an application for the Santos Engineering Scholarship Program. It's a fund I established 5 years ago after Ed died to help kids from circumstances similar to mine pursue engineering degrees. Full tuition, books, living expenses, everything needed to complete a 4-year degree at any accredited engineering school. Danny looked between his mother and Julian, clearly sensing the tension in the air, but not fully understanding its source. The scholarship isn't charity, Julian continued quickly, seeing Tess's expression. It's competitive. Applicants have to demonstrate academic ability, mechanical aptitude, and personal character. But Danny wouldn't just qualify. He'd be exactly the kind of student the program was designed to help. Tess took the envelope with hands that weren't quite steady. Julian, we can't. You can't what, accept help? Let someone else invest in Danny's future the way Ed Santos invested in mine. It's too much. This kind of opportunity, people like us don't get opportunities like this. That's exactly why programs like this exist, Julian said firmly. Because people like you and Danny do deserve opportunities like this, but they don't often get them. Ed Santos saw potential in a kid from foster care and decided to do something about it. I saw the same potential in Danny, and I can do something about it too. Danny had been listening to this exchange with growing excitement. Mom, does this mean I could really go to college to study engineering? Tess looked at her son's hopeful face, then at the scholarship application in her hands, then at Julian, who was watching her with an expression of genuine care and concern. I need to think about this, she said finally. Of course you do. There's no pressure, no timeline. The scholarship program runs year-round, and Danny still has 6 years before he'd need to use it. But I wanted you to know that the option exists. Julian stood up and brushed dust off his jeans. I should probably head back to Denver. I've got meetings tomorrow. As he gathered his things, Danny spoke up. Mr. Cross, Julian, thank you for telling me about Ed Santos and for thinking I might be smart enough for a scholarship. Danny, you're not just smart enough. You're exactly the kind of person who's going to change the world someday. I'm sure of it. After Julian left, Tess sat in the quiet hangar, holding the scholarship application and trying to process what had just happened. The envelope felt substantial, official, and somehow life-changing, in a way that frightened her as much as it excited her. Mom? Danny's voice was small, uncertain. Are you okay? I'm okay, sweetheart. Just trying to figure out what all this means. It means I might be able to go to college, right? Like Julian did? Tess looked at her son and saw not just the 12-year-old boy who still needed her protection, but also the young man he was becoming, full of dreams and potential that she wanted desperately to help him achieve. Yeah, kiddo, it might mean exactly that. Over the following month, the scholarship application sat on Tess's kitchen table like a door to a future she'd never imagined possible. She'd read through it countless times, studying the requirements, the timeline, the implications of what accepting such an opportunity would mean for both her and Danny's lives. The application itself was comprehensive, but not intimidating. Academic transcripts, letters of recommendation, an essay about career goals, and a practical demonstration of mechanical aptitude. Danny could easily meet all the requirements. His grades were excellent, his teachers spoke highly of his potential, and he'd been helping Tess with aircraft maintenance for years. But accepting the scholarship would mean changes that went far beyond just paying for college. It would mean acknowledging that her son's future lay beyond the small mountain town where they'd built their life together. It would mean trusting a man she'd known for only a few weeks with her most precious hope, Danny's success and happiness. Julian had continued his weekend visits, but he'd been careful not to pressure her about the scholarship. Instead, he'd focused on building a genuine friendship with both of them. He helped Danny with his science project, learning about aerodynamics and model aircraft construction with the enthusiasm of someone discovering a new hobby. He brought books about aviation and engineering, always presenting them as loans rather than gifts to avoid triggering Tess's pride. Most surprisingly, he'd also started helping Tess with some of the more routine maintenance tasks around the airfield. His mechanical skills were rudimentary, but he was a quick learner and genuinely interested in understanding how things worked. Watching him struggle with tasks that were second nature to her, Tess had begun to appreciate the different types of intelligence that had made him successful in business. Danny's science project had evolved into something far more sophisticated than the simple model airplane it had started as. With Julian's encouragement and resources, the boy had designed and built a functioning remote-controlled aircraft, complete with working control surfaces and a small electric motor. The project had become a symbol of what Danny could accomplish when given proper support and encouragement. "It flies," Danny announced excitedly as he brought the completed model into the hangar for a test flight demonstration. "Julian helped me balance the center of gravity, and now it flies perfectly." Tess examined the small aircraft with professional interest. The construction was precise, the control systems were properly configured, and the overall design showed real understanding of aeronautical principles. This wasn't just a boy playing with toys. This was a young engineer learning his craft. "This is impressive work, Danny. Really impressive. Julian says I should enter it in the state science fair. He thinks it might win something." The mention of the science fair brought up another decision Tess had been avoiding. The state competition was held in Denver, which would mean travel expenses, hotel costs, and time away from work that she couldn't really afford. But it would also be an opportunity for Danny to showcase his abilities and potentially earn recognition that could help with future educational opportunities. We'll see, kiddo. That's a big trip and it's expensive. I could pay for it, Julian offered quietly. He'd been watching the aircraft demonstration from across the hangar, giving them space to share the moment, while still being available to help if needed. Julian, not as charity, as an investment in a promising young engineer's future. Science fair competitions look good on scholarship applications. The comment was casual, but Tess caught the underlying message. Julian wasn't just thinking about the immediate future. He was thinking years ahead, to when Danny would need every possible advantage in pursuing his education and career goals. That evening, after Julian had returned to Denver and Danny was asleep, Tess found herself on the phone with her mother for the first time in weeks. "You sound different, honey," her mother said, after they'd covered the usual topics of health, weather, and local news. "Different how?" "I don't know. Lighter, maybe? Less worried than you usually sound." Tess considered this observation. It was true that she'd been feeling more optimistic lately, though she hadn't consciously recognized the change until her mother mentioned it. "I've met someone, Mom. Actually, Danny and I both have. It's complicated." She found herself telling her mother the whole story. The emergency landing, Julian's repair needs, his subsequent visits, and the scholarship opportunity. As she talked, she realized how unlikely the entire sequence of events sounded when described to someone who hadn't lived through it. "Honey, this sounds almost too good to be true. Are you sure this man's motivations are what they seem to be?" The question didn't offend Tess because she'd been asking herself the same thing for weeks. But the more time she spent with Julian, the more convinced she became that his interest in helping Danny was genuine. "I think so, Mom. He's not what I expected a wealthy businessman to be like. He's normal, kind, interested in Danny for the right reasons." "And what about you? Is he interested in you for the right reasons?" Tess was quiet for a long moment. The growing connection between her and Julian was something she'd been trying not to think about too directly. There was definitely an attraction there, a compatibility that went beyond their shared concern for Danny's future. But the differences in their circumstances made any romantic relationship seem impossibly complicated. "I don't know, Mom. Maybe. It's hard to tell where gratitude ends and genuine feelings begin, for him or for you." Another question Tess couldn't easily answer. Julian had changed her life in fundamental ways, opened doors she'd never even known existed. But was her growing affection for him based on appreciation for what he'd done, or on who he was as a person? The following Saturday, Julian arrived at the airfield with news that would force some of these unresolved questions into the open. "I've been thinking about the science fair," he said, as they watched Danny conduct a test flight of his model aircraft in the hangar. "And I had an idea I wanted to run by both of you." "What kind of idea?" Tess asked, though she was already suspicious of the enthusiasm in his voice. "What if, instead of just entering Danny's project in the state science fair, we took it to the national competition? It's being held in Washington, D.C. this year, and I think Danny's work is sophisticated enough to compete at that level." Danny's face lit up with excitement. "National competition? Really? Really? I've seen the work that typically wins these competitions, and your aircraft project is easily as good as anything that's been entered in recent years." Tess felt her stomach tighten with familiar anxiety. National competition would mean even greater expenses, more time away from work, and exposure to a world where people like Danny and her were expected to fail rather than succeed. "Julian, that's incredibly generous, but you're worried about the cost and the logistics and whether Danny would fit in with kids from wealthy families and expensive private schools." The accuracy of his assessment caught her off guard. "Something like that, yes." Julian knelt down to Danny's level. "Danny, what do you think? Would you like to enter your aircraft in the National Science Fair?" "More than anything," Danny replied without hesitation, "but only if Mom thinks it's okay." Both males turned to look at Tess, and she felt the weight of decision-making that had become familiar over years of single parenthood. Every choice she made affected not just her own future, but Danny's as well. The safe choice was to stay home, stay small, stay within the boundaries of what they knew and could manage on their own. But looking at Danny's hopeful face and at Julian's quiet confidence in her son's abilities, Tess realized that playing it safe might actually be the most dangerous choice of all. "All right," she said finally, "we'll go to Washington." The smile that spread across Danny's face was worth every bit of anxiety the decision had cost her. Julian's expression was more subtle but equally pleased, and Tess got the impression that this competition was about more than just Danny's science project. It was about proving to herself that she and her son belonged in a larger world than the one they'd been inhabiting. "There's one more thing," Julian said, as Danny went back to flying his model aircraft. "The scholarship application deadline is coming up in 6 weeks. If Danny's serious about applying, we should probably start working on the essay portion soon." Tess nodded, feeling the momentum of change accelerating around them. 6 weeks ago, her biggest worry had been whether she could afford to take Danny on a vacation to see the ocean. Now she was planning a trip to the nation's capital and considering educational opportunities that could reshape her son's entire future. "Julian," she said quietly, "what if we're in over our heads? What if Danny gets to this competition and realizes he's not as smart as we think he is? Then he'll learn something valuable about resilience and perseverance," Julian replied. "But I don't think that's going to happen. Danny's not just smart, he's got the kind of practical intelligence that solves real problems. That's exactly what the world needs more of." As they watched Danny skillfully maneuver his model aircraft through a series of complex aerial maneuvers, Tess found herself beginning to believe that maybe, just maybe, her son really could compete with anyone. The acceptance letter arrived on a Tuesday morning in early April, delivered by overnight mail in a thick envelope that made Tess's hands shake as she signed for it. Danny had already left for school, which was probably for the best. This was a moment she needed to experience alone first, to process whatever the letter contained before sharing the news with her son. She sat at her kitchen table with a cup of coffee growing cold beside her, staring at the envelope from the Santos Engineering Scholarship Program. The logo was embossed, professional, serious. This wasn't the kind of correspondence that usually found its way to her mailbox. When she finally opened it, the first thing she saw was a single word printed in bold letters across the top of the page. "Congratulations." Danny had been accepted. Full scholarship, 4 years, any accredited engineering program in the United States. The letter went on to detail the specifics: tuition, books, living expenses, even a stipend for educational travel and internships. It was more money than Tess made in 3 years, freely given to help her son pursue his dreams. She read the letter 3 times before the reality of it fully sank in. Danny was going to college. Danny was going to be an engineer. Everything she'd hoped for him, but never quite believed was possible, had suddenly become not just possible, but guaranteed. The tears came without warning, a mixture of joy, relief, and overwhelming gratitude that left her sitting alone in her kitchen sobbing into her hands. For 12 years, she'd carried the weight of being Danny's only advocate, his only protection against a world that didn't always value kids from small towns with single mothers. Now, suddenly, that burden was shared. Her phone rang while she was still wiping her eyes, and Julian's name appeared on the screen. "Tess, I just wanted to let you know that the scholarship committee made their decision. Have you—" "He got it," she said, her voice still thick with tears. "Julian, he got it. I know, congratulations. You should be incredibly proud. I don't know how to thank you. This changes everything for him. You don't need to thank me. Danny earned this on his own merit. The scholarship committee reviewed his application blind. They had no idea about my connection to your family. He won this scholarship because he's exceptional, not because he knows me." The distinction mattered to Tess more than Julian probably realized. Danny's success would be his own achievement, not something handed to him because of circumstances beyond his control. "There's something Else in the envelope, Julian continued, a smaller letter addressed to you specifically. Tess looked back at the contents of the envelope and found a second sealed letter with her name written in Julian's familiar handwriting. Julian, what is this? Open it and see. She broke the seal with trembling fingers and unfolded a single sheet of paper. The letterhead was from Crosswinds Venture Capital, but the tone was personal, intimate. Tess, the letter began, by the time you read this, Danny will have received confirmation of his scholarship acceptance. I wanted you to know that working with your family over these past months has been one of the most meaningful experiences of my professional life. Watching Danny's excitement about learning, seeing your dedication to his future, being included in your daily lives, these things have reminded me why I established the scholarship program in the first place. But more than that, getting to know you has made me realize that I've been living a life that was professionally successful, but personally empty. You've shown me what it means to have real priorities, to care about things that matter more than profit margins and business deals. I don't want to complicate Danny's educational opportunities with personal considerations, so I want to be clear that his scholarship is secure regardless of how you respond to what I'm about to ask. But I've fallen in love with you, Tess, with your strength, your integrity, your fierce protectiveness of your son, and your ability to find joy in simple things that I'd forgotten how to appreciate. I know our circumstances are very different, and I know you have good reasons to be cautious about letting someone like me into your life. But I hope you'll consider giving us a chance to see what we might build together, not as a wealthy benefactor and a grateful recipient, but as two people who've found something in each other that they didn't even know they were looking for. If you're interested in exploring this possibility, meet me at the airfield on Saturday afternoon. If you're not, I'll understand, and we'll find a way to maintain a friendship that allows me to watch Danny succeed without making things awkward for your family. Whatever you decide, please know that you and Danny have changed my life for the better, and I'll always be grateful for the night my plane broke down at Copper Ridge. With love and respect, Julian. Tess read the letter twice, her emotions cycling through surprise, fear, hope, and something that might have been joy. Julian was offering her not just a relationship, but a partnership between equals who had found something valuable in each other. The practical part of her mind immediately began cataloguing all the reasons why a romance between them was complicated, risky, potentially disastrous. They came from different worlds, had different resources, different expectations about life, but the part of her that had been lonely for 8 years, that had forgotten what it felt like to be seen and valued as a woman rather than just as Danny's mother, responded to Julian's words with an enthusiasm that surprised her with its intensity. She folded the letter carefully and tucked it back into its envelope, then picked up her phone to call the school. Danny needed to know about the scholarship, and she needed time to think about everything else Julian had offered her. Copper Ridge Elementary. This is Mrs. Patterson. This is Tess Morgan, Danny's mother. I need to speak with him, please. We just received some very good news. Saturday afternoon arrived grey and cold, with the promise of spring still weeks away in the high mountains. Tess had spent 3 days thinking about Julian's letter, 3 days weighing the risks and possibilities of what he was offering. She'd talked to her mother. She'd lain awake at night staring at the ceiling. She'd even found herself asking Danny what he thought about Julian, though without revealing the full context of her questions. I like him, Mom, Danny had said simply. He's smart and he listens when I talk about stuff, and he makes you smile more than you used to. Out of the mouths of babes. Now she stood in the hangar, ostensibly working on a routine oil change for Dr. Morrison's Cessna, but really just waiting to see if Julian would actually appear. Part of her hoped he wouldn't. It would make her decision easier, remove the temptation to risk the stable life she'd built for herself and Danny. But a larger part of her hoped desperately that he would come, that she'd have the chance to take the leap of faith his letter had offered. Danny was at a friend's house for the afternoon, working on a group project that was due Monday. Tess had arranged this deliberately, wanting privacy for whatever conversation was about to happen. Some decisions were too important to make with a 12-year-old audience, no matter how mature that 12-year-old might be. She heard Julian's truck before she saw it, the familiar sound of the engine echoing off the hangar. Walls as he pulled into the parking area. Her heart rate spiked, and she found herself wiping her hands nervously on a rag, even though they weren't particularly dirty. He appeared in the hangar doorway looking uncertain, perhaps even nervous, an expression she'd never seen on his face. During their previous encounters, he was dressed casually in jeans and a sweater, but she could see the tension in his posture, the careful way he was watching her face for clues about her decision. "Hi," he said simply. "Hi yourself." They stood, looking at each other across the hangar floor, and Tess realized that everything was about to change, one way or another. Either she was about to begin a relationship that could transform her life, or she was about to end a friendship that had already meant more to her than she'd been willing to admit. "I got your letter," she said finally. "I figured you had. Any thoughts?" Tess set down her tools and walked closer to where he stood. She'd been practicing this conversation in her head for days, but now that the moment was here, all her prepared speeches seemed inadequate. "Julian, what you wrote, it was beautiful and terrifying. Terrifying. You're offering to change my entire life, Danny's entire life. That's not something I can take lightly." Julian nodded slowly. "I understand, and I want you to know that I've been thinking about that too. About what it would mean for both of you if we tried to build something together." He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small, wrapped package. "I brought you something. Not a gift exactly, more like a symbol of what I'm hoping we can create." Tess unwrapped the package carefully, revealing a pair of work coveralls that were clearly brand new but designed for serious use. They were high-quality, professional grade, with reinforced knees and pockets configured for the tools she used every day. But what made them special was the embroidery over the left breast pocket. "Tess Morgan, certified aircraft mechanic." "Julian, I've been thinking about how this could work," he said quickly, as if afraid she might interrupt before he could explain. "About how we could be together without me trying to rescue you or change who you are. Because I don't want to change who you are. Tess, I love who you are." He gestured toward the coveralls. "You're brilliant at what you do. You're respected in your field. You have skills that are valuable and needed. I don't want you to give that up to become some kind of trophy wife living in Denver." "Then what are you suggesting?" "I'm suggesting that maybe I could move my base of operations here. Maybe I could learn to be the kind of person who belongs in a place like Copper Ridge. Maybe we could figure out how to combine your expertise with my resources to build something that works for both of us." Tess looked down at the coveralls, running her fingers over the embroidered lettering. They represented something she'd never had before. Recognition of her professional identity, validation that she was more than just Danny's mother or a woman in a traditionally male field. "You'd move here? Leave Denver?" "I'd move anywhere you wanted me to move. The business can be run from anywhere with decent internet access. And honestly, I've been happier these past few months coming here on weekends than I've been in years of living in the city. Julian, I need you to understand something. If we do this, if we try to build a relationship, it can't be about gratitude. It can't be about what you've done for Danny or what you might do for us in the future. It has to be about us, just us, as people who care about each other. I understand, and I need you to understand something too. This isn't about me wanting to save you or fix your life. This is about me wanting to share a life with someone who's already figured out what really matters." Tess looked at Julian, really looked at him, and saw not the wealthy businessman who had emerged from a disabled aircraft 3 months ago, but the man who had spent Saturday afternoons learning about aircraft maintenance, who had encouraged Danny's dreams, who had shared stories about his own difficult childhood without self-pity or calculation. "Okay," she said quietly. "Okay? Okay, let's try this. Let's see what we can build together." The smile that spread across Julian's face was like sunrise after a long winter night, full of warmth and promise, and the hope of better days ahead. 18 months later, Tess stood in the same hangar where she'd first met Julian Cross, but everything had changed. The space had been expanded and modernized, equipped with state-of-the-art diagnostic equipment and tool systems that made her work more efficient and precise. A new sign outside read, "Copper Ridge Aviation Services, Tess Morgan Chief Mechanic," and her appointment book was filled with clients from across the western United States who sought out her expertise. Danny, now 14 and taller than his mother, was working alongside her on a routine inspection of a Cirrus SR-22. He'd grown into his intelligence over the past year and a half, developing the kind of quiet confidence that came from knowing he had options, opportunities, a future that stretched as far as his imagination could take him. "Mum, the oil pressure sensor readings look inconsistent," he called out from the cockpit where he was running through the aircraft's systems check. "What kind of inconsistent?" Tess replied, not looking up from the engine compartment where she was examining the fuel injection system, fluctuating between normal and low, but the actual oil pressure seems fine when I check it manually. Sounds like the sensor itself is failing. Mark it for replacement and add it to the work order. This easy partnership between mother and son had deepened as Danny had grown older and more skilled. He spent most of his free time at the airfield now, learning not just about aircraft maintenance, but about running a business, managing clients, and solving the kinds of complex problems that couldn't be found in textbooks. The national science fair had been a triumph. Danny's remote-controlled aircraft had won second place in the engineering category, competing against students from elite prep schools and specialized STEM programs. More importantly, the experience had given him confidence that he could hold his own in any academic environment. His high school grades remained excellent, and his early college entrance exams suggested he'd have his choice of engineering programs when the time came. Julian emerged from the office area of the hangar, where he'd been conducting a video conference with investors in San Francisco. He'd made good on his promise to relocate his business operations to Copper Ridge, converting the airfield's former storage building into a modern office suite. Crosswinds Venture Capital now operated from the mountains of Colorado, and Julian had discovered that many of his clients actually preferred meeting in the relaxed, scenic environment rather than in sterile conference rooms in Denver. "How's the Cirrus looking?" he asked, moving to help Tess with a particularly stubborn fuel line connection. "Good overall. Danny caught a sensor issue that could have caused problems down the line. He's getting good at the diagnostic work." Julian smiled with pride that had become as natural as breathing. Danny wasn't officially his stepson. He and Tess had chosen to take their relationship slowly, building a foundation of trust and compatibility before making legal commitments. But in every way that mattered, the three of them had become a family. "Speaking of Danny's diagnostic skills," Julian said, "I had an interesting call this morning. The admissions officer from MIT's early enrollment program. Apparently, Danny's application made quite an impression." Danny looked up from his work with sudden interest. "MIT called?" "They did. It seems they're very interested in having you join their aerospace engineering program. Full academic scholarship, of course. But they also mentioned something about a work-study position in their aircraft design lab." Tess felt the familiar mixture of pride and anxiety that came with watching her son's opportunities expand beyond anything she'd imagined possible. MIT was the kind of institution where kids like Danny weren't supposed to succeed. Yet here he was, being recruited by one of the most prestigious engineering schools in the world. "What do you think, kiddo?" she asked. Danny was quiet for a moment, considering. At 14, he'd developed the habit of thinking carefully before speaking, weighing options and consequences with a maturity that sometimes surprised adults who didn't know him well. "I think I'd like to visit the campus," he said finally. "See what their facilities are like, meet some of the professors, but I'm not in any hurry to leave Colorado. There's still a lot I want to learn here first." The response was so perfectly balanced, ambitious but grounded, excited about opportunities but appreciative of what he already had, that both Tess and Julian found themselves smiling. "We'll arrange a visit," Julian said. "But you're right. There's no rush. You've got time to explore your options and make the choice that's right for you." As the afternoon wore on, the three of them worked together with the easy rhythm of people who had learned to anticipate each other's needs and movements. Tess found herself thinking about how different this scene was from the lonely evening she'd spent in this same hangar just 2 years ago, when it had been just her and Danny against the world. The framed photograph on her workbench captured a moment from Danny's high school graduation ceremony the previous spring. The three of them stood together in the sunshine, Danny in his cap and gown, Tess and Julian on either side of him, with expressions of pride and love that needed no explanation. It had been Julian's idea to frame the photo, and it had become the centerpiece of Tess's workspace, a daily reminder of how far they'd all come. As the sun began to set behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink that never failed to take her breath away, Tess realized that she'd found something she hadn't even known she was looking for. Not just financial security or romantic love or educational opportunities for Danny, but a sense of completeness, of being part of something larger than herself. The grease stains on her hands were the same as they'd always been, evidence of honest work well done. But now they were part of a larger story, a story about second chances, about the power of believing in each other, about what could happen when courage met opportunity in the middle of a Colorado snowstorm. Danny finished his work on the Cirrus and began cleaning his tools with the same methodical precision his mother had taught him. Julian locked up the office and joined them for the final cleanup of the day. And Tess looked around the hangar that had been the site of so many beginnings and knew that the best parts of their story were still being written. Outside, the first stars were beginning to appear in the clear mountain sky, distant lights that reminded her that there were infinite possibilities waiting to be discovered by anyone brave enough to reach for them.